We hear the ambiguous, loss or grief, and disenfranchised grief. So tell us the difference between the two and they're about.
Okay, ambiguous grief is when you can't really put your finger on what you're grieving about. It's just this kind of generalized grief. It may manifest itself as anger, it itself as depression, it manifests itself as guilt. You may do some bargaining. You know, if I advocate hard enough, maybe my loved one will end up not being So ambiguous is that can't really be to one particular incident. It's just this generalized loss. And then the grief, we're disenfranchised from the rest of society because most people don't understand, why are you grieving when your loved one is still here?
Mm. Yes, yes.
But we do.
Yeah.
It's valid.
Definitely valid. So who all does grief affect, and what does that look like?
Affects everyone in the family.
Yeah.
It affects not only caregiver, it affects the person who has Huntington's because they're grieving about all of the things that they've lost or will lose, especially if they've grown up in a family with Huntington's and they've seen what it does and they know what to expect. Sometimes I think that's harder than in a family that is dealing with Huntington's for the first time. So it affects the caregivers, it affects the children. And I know you through that with your kids.
Yeah.
Tremendous amount of grief over the loss of a parent and over the loss of a normal. And then there's the grief that's attached to a child wondering, am I going to end up the same way?
Right. And it's so interesting, isn't it, that you're in the process of grieving, because I know that you and Randy, Paul, so you're
Right.
you're in the process of grieving yourself, and then you have to also watch carefully your children. It's so hard. Sometimes it's even hard to see what's all the way around us. And even our children are grieving. And as a mother, you're supporting all of it. And often I put aside because we have to support the family.
That's very true. Yeah. There are times when you have to be strong for your kids.
Yeah.
And because of that, you come last.
Yeah.
One of the things that happened with Randy, he had 2 suicides. And I think a lot of that came from, had an uncle that he was very to, who was really a father figure to him. Paul wasn't really able to be much of a dad anymore. He had an uncle who did commit suicide. And so he saw that. And then he saw another uncle who had a very early onset, probably 20 or 21, was affected very physically. So his symptoms were very obvious. And they watched his dad. And we went through so much trauma with his dad. He at one time picked him up by his neck and left bruise around his neck. Paul took him out and let him run the motor, and he was 5 years old and gave the engine too much gas and it threw him at the seat, and he hit his face on an aluminum rod holder, and he had to have a plastic surgeon fix the injury on his face. and he saw, his dad didn't know what to do. His dad took him and he called me and said, this happened. Meet me at the emergency room. And, so he had seen these things that happen with HD. And part of the problem was that he was abusing drugs and alcohol. He beat his medication. And so those things played into it as well.
Sure.
But the underlying reason for his attempting suicide was the deep-seated grief that he felt. In the HD community, we learn to be resilient.
Yes.
We learn to bounce back, to be that red rubber ball that just keeps bouncing. There's a mental resilience, there's a physical, there's an emotional. We have to take care of ourselves.